Let's pray. Make that our prayer. God, we do. We want you to open our hearts, open our minds. And God, what we want you to do is we want you to fill us up. And God, this is our prayer today. Just do your work in us and through us. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, so we're going to be in 2 Samuel chapter 6. All right, and this is the interesting part. A lot of the guys that I like to read about, a lot of the preachers I like to follow, this is what happens. They go through the life of David, and then they get to chapter 6, and they skip it. And I thought, well, that's weak. This is a great text. This is a great passage. This is incredible. We should be looking at it. And then I started studying it, and I thought, oh, now I know why they skip it. So I'm going to show you today why most preachers just skip over this text, because there's some hard things. There's some hard things. A lot of people might read 2 Samuel chapter 6, and don't read ahead, okay? Because I know some of you are like, what is he talking about? What is going on, right? But there's some hard things sometimes that happen that come into the text. And all of a sudden, that's why people reject the Bible. That's why they don't like Christianity. One of the reasons that they think, whoa, how in the world does this happen? And I just need to tell you, foundationally and principally, where I come from, okay? 2 Corinthians chapter 3 talks about the wisdom of God and about the wisdom of man, and how God's wisdom is so much bigger than all of man's wisdom, right? That the foolishness of God is even better than all of man's wisdom. And so sometimes when I'm reading through the Old Testament especially, I'm reading through and I'm thinking, what? Why in the world, God, would you do that? Like Noah, how many of you ever read about Noah, right? And we just read it, we're like, oh, what a cute little Bible story. No! God saves one family and he kills everybody else. Does anybody go, right? And you're thinking, what in the world is going on here? What, God, why would you do something like that? And you can think of time after time after time after time, right? Moses is walking down with the tablets, and they've created, the Ten Commandments, and they've created these golden calves, and they crush it up, and God makes them drink it. Well, that's an interesting punishment, God. When my kids are out making castles of dirt and they start worshiping it, I'm going to make them eat the dirt. You know what I mean? You just start thinking about these different passages as you go through the Old Testament. You're thinking, really, God? What in the world why? And I have to step back and I have to remember, my ways and God's ways are not always the same ways, right? And according to what I understand of God, God's ways are so much better and so much bigger than my ways. His wisdom is greater than all of my wisdom. And so I'm approaching this text today with that in mind. Does that make sense? You guys with me? Cool. So let's get started. Acts chapter 13 says this. I know, I said 2 Samuel, and they're like, Acts? What's he talking about? So Acts chapter 13 talks about David. This is what it says. And when he had removed him, talking about Saul, right? Saul had been removed from the kingship. And so if you were to read through 1 and 2 Samuel by now, you would know that Saul is no longer king. David has been made king. This is what it says. When he removed him, he raised up David to be their king, of whom he testified and said, I have found in David, the son of Jesse, a man after my own heart, who will do all my will. How many of you have ever heard this about David? Right? You guys have heard David was a man after whose heart? God's heart, right? And we don't even know what that means, but we say it because that's who David is. Well, it goes on to say he did the will of God, right? That's what it is. And so this man's offspring, God has brought to Israel a Savior, Jesus, as he promised. And so literally, David is now king. David is wanting to do some things as king, right? He's kind of earned the spot. God promised it to him. He ran for his life for like 9 or 10 years because Saul wanted to kill him. So Saul's now dead. David is now king, and he wants to do some things, and this is David's concern. And it has to do with the Ark of the Covenant. All right? That's what we're going to talk about today, is the Ark of the Covenant. Now, we're not talking about Noah's Ark here, okay? We're talking about the Ark of the Covenant. And so what is the Ark, and where was the Ark? And so this is how I'm going to describe it to you, okay? I'm going to do my best to explain what the Ark was. It was this fairly large wooden box that was covered with gold inside and outside, okay? And on top of it was these two cherubim, and basically they're angels, and they're looking at each other. And Moses made the ark just as God had commanded him to do. And so then they put the ark in the tabernacle in the temple of Israel. And there was only one piece of furniture in this back room, okay? And the back room was kind of it's where the big deals were made, all right? Because once a year, the holy priest would go to the back room and ask God for the forgiveness of all the sins of all the people for the last year. And so it's sort of and only the high priest was allowed to go back there. Nobody else was allowed to go back there. And so here it is. It's in this room that's called the Holy of Holies. And it's the place where God's presence dwelled. And the only place that you could go to experience that presence was to go into that room where the high priest would go and ask God for the forgiveness of sins. So you guys with me so far? So the ark, it really became a significant part of Israel's history because you remember they get released from Egypt. I'm trying to get my words here. Released out of Egypt, they wander around for 40 years in the desert, and this is when the Ark of the Covenant of the God is built. It's where it's created. But then they finally get to go into the Promised Land. You remember this? They get to the Jordan River, and the Jordan River is flooded, and there's too much water, and the Israelites start complaining and grumbling because that's what people do, right? That's what we do, or you do rather, right? So we're grumblers, and we like to grumble and complain, and they get there, and they're like, God's brought us to die again, and Joshua says, no, and so he goes and prays to God, and God says, go through the water, put your feet in the water, right? And so who is it that goes and puts their feet in the water first? It's the Levites who are carrying the Ark of the Covenant, and they go to the Jordan River, and they put their feet in the Jordan River, and the water literally stops upstream so that they can cross over on dry land. Well, a few days later, they're at Jericho, and they're marching around Jericho, right? And who's leading the march? Well, it's the Levites carrying the Ark of the Covenant, and they march around Jericho, and finally, Jericho, the walls come tumbling down, right? And so this Ark, it has a pivotal part, a crucial part, a significant part of Israel's history. And so then during the time of Eli, who was one of the leaders of Israel, one of the judges of Israel, one of the priests, so Eli's sons decide that they're going to take the Ark of the Covenant of God down to a fight that they're fighting against the Philistines. Because here's their concept. Listen, we'll win. If we've got the Ark of the Covenant with us, we will win this battle. Well, guess what happens? They lose. They lose. And so then the Philistines are like, hey, look at this, a trophy. Right? And so they take this trophy, this Ark of the Covenant, thinking it's a trophy, into their land, and they take it. But guess what happens to the Philistines? God starts dumping havoc on their lives because it doesn't belong to them. And so all sorts of crazy things happen, and there's all sorts of havoc going on with the Philistines. And so they're like, we don't want this anymore. This has caused some problems for us. So literally, they take it and they drop it off right outside, right inside the border of Israel. They're like, we don't want to go too far. We're just going to kind of put it right there. There it is. And literally, during the entire reign of Saul, that's where it sat, which just kind of gives us an indication of Saul's ambivalent heart towards God, right? Have we ever placed God on the periphery and just kind of let him sit there for years and years, asking God the question, why in the world aren't you doing something? And so this is literally what Saul did. He just kind of put God on the periphery. It sat there for years, literally for years. And so we just see his relationship with God through this. So David, fast forward, he's now king. He wants the ark because it represents the presence of God. So he wants the ark. He wants to bring it back. And so David is going to recruit literally 30,000 men to bring this ark back. It wasn't very big, mind you, but he needs 30,000 men because David is going to mount this enormous ceremonial procession or this parade to bring the ark back into the city. You with me so far? So let's pick up 2 Samuel chapter 6, verse 1. It says this, David again gathered all the chosen men of Israel, 30,000 of them. And David arose and he went with all the people who were with him from Baal Judah to bring up from there the ark of God, which is called by the name of the Lord of hosts, who sits enthroned on the cherubim, right? And they called the ark of God, they carried the ark of God on a new cart and brought it out of the house of Abinadab, which was on a hill. I'm like, why did we need to know that his house was on a hill? I'm not for sure, but it's there. And Uzzah and Ahio, all right? So I had to look up this word because I'm like, how in the world do you say this? And I just figured out, it's A-E-I-O, right? Arnold McDonald had a farm. E-I-O. It's Ahio, right? That's how I'm remembering it today. So just deal with me, okay? the sons of Abinadab. And they were driving the new cart, and the ark of God, and Ahio went back before the ark, was in front of it. Okay, you picturing this so far? You guys trying to, right? So I just want to bring a couple of principles out as we read each section of Scripture. Just a couple of principles. Here's the first one. David wanted to remind Israel that God was the actual king of Israel. That's what David wanted to do. David wanted to remind Israel who the real king was. David had become king of Israel with God's help, right? And so there's an incredible leadership lesson here because David's thinking, how in the world can I show the people of Israel that God is the one true king of Israel? How can I show the people not to trust just in military might or political power, but to trust solely and completely on God because God is the actual real king? And so he's thinking, I must bring God's house of worship to the capital city, and we can't have the house of worship without the Ark of the Covenant, which is what represents God's presence. And so this is the big deal. What David's doing is he's saying, listen, I want all the people to understand that God is the real king. I just happen to be the earthly king, but I want us to worship, and I want us to honor, and I want us to give glory to the real king, not to me. And so this is incredible. David's heart is motivated purely, and I love this. Another reality is this, that David had a hunger and a thirst for God's presence. He just did. We can read the exact same story in 1 Chronicles chapter 13, 14, and 15. And what happens if you're reading 1 Chronicles 13, 14, and 15 is we get some of the phrases that we know David was actually singing, right? They're called Psalms. We can read them in the Psalms. He was actually singing these as he was going to pick up the Ark of the Covenant. And so things like this, strength and joy in the dwelling place. Have you ever read that in the Psalms? Strength and joy exist in the dwelling place. And so David, being a leader, he wants people to be able to worship God. He has this incredible burden, and it's incredibly hard for him to be the leader. But what he wants to do is he knew that the only hope he could have is if his hope was built based on the presence of God. And so he wants the presence of God to be with him. This is huge. And so another reality that we see here is the ark was a reminder that God would dwell with his people. That God would dwell with his people, that they could have this authentic connection, this authentic relationship with God, and they could know God, and they could enter into God's presence, and God would be there. This is what David wanted. This was the strength and joy that he talked about. He wanted to live right next to the house of God where God lived. He didn't want just people to know God. He wanted them to really know God. He wanted them not to just know about God, but he wanted them not just to be moral and religious in the general way. He wanted them to really know God. And the ark was a big part of bringing it back to the city so that people could truly experience him. And so this is why he needed the ark and wanted the ark. You guys with me so far? All right, good. Good. This is important because here's what's crazy. There's a problem with the ark. A big problem. You know what the problem was? God's presence. And I know some of you are thinking, what? Why would that be a problem? This is why. Because David's like, I want God's presence right next door to me. I want it there. I want him to help me win the battles. I want him to help me govern the people. I want him to help me do all these things, right? This is kind of what we think. But what we realize is all of a sudden when you have God's presence, is God's presence starts dealing with things that we really don't want him to deal with. Have you ever done this? God, would you deal with my wife and just straighten her out, right? And what does God do? Bam! He starts dealing with our own hearts, doesn't he? Right? We start complaining to God about our kids. God, if you just grab our kids and deal with them. But what happens? All of a sudden, God grabs us and deals with us. See, we like God's presence as long as he's doing what we like him to do, right? But as soon as God starts to deal with us, we're like, I don't know about this God's presence thing. So there's a big problem here, and the big problem is God's presence. And what we read about right now, what we're going to read is going to create a lot of issues. And there's a lot of people who struggle with these texts. I've already said this, but look what happens. And I'm going to do my very best to try to explain it the way I know how to explain it, okay? But this is one of those passages that people read and they think, how can your God be so loving? You talk about this loving God, but I don't see it. I don't like the Bible. God did some mean things in the Bible, right? And some people say, I don't even like Christianity because your God does some of these harsh, mean, terrible things to people. And so here it is. You ready? 2 Samuel chapter 6, verse 6 says this. And when they came to the threshing floor of Nacon, Uzzah put out his hand to the ark of God and took hold of it, for the oxen stumbled. And the anger of the Lord was kindled against Uzzah, and God struck him down there because of his error, and he died there right beside the ark of God. What? I mean, you catching the picture, right? There's this huge celebration, 30,000 men, there's tambourines, and there's all sorts of these other instruments that I've never even heard of listed in the Bible, okay? And so they're playing them, and they're singing, and they're dancing, and they're bringing this Ark of the Covenant. It's on this cart, right? It's being led by an ox. How many of you have driven an ox cart lately? Okay, so you really didn't drive it. And so if you had an ox cart, the ox would be there. You would either be walking beside the cart or in front of the cart, and the ox would follow you. How they got him to do that, I have no idea. But this is what's going on. The ox cart just hits a spot in the road, and it seems to shift the Ark of the Covenant. And Uzzah's like, oh, it's going to fall in the dirt. I'm going to save it. And he puts his hand out. In this huge parade where people are singing and dancing. I mean, you talk about peeing on your parade, right? Serious. This guy dies right there, right then. The party stops. Drop the mic moment, right? How do we deal with this? Uzzah and Ahio and these young men, they were sons of Abinadab, and they were put in charge of the ox cart and actually put the ark on the ox cart. And the ox cart with no driver kind of hits this spot in the ground, and the ox stumbles a little bit, and Uzzah puts out his hand because the ark of God was shaking, and it was rattling, and it was shifting, and it was in danger of falling in the dirt. And so Uzzah puts his hand out, and bam, he's dead. Just like that. So I've got another picture here of the ark. One of the things that we read about in 1 Chronicles is that God gave Moses very, very specific instructions for the ark. I mean, God gave them very specific directions on how the ark should be moved and how the ark should be touched. And when the ark was made, Moses told God, and so you can look up here in the picture, to put 4 golden rings at the corners of the ark, and then to take 2 wooden poles and cover them in gold and put those through the golden rings. And these poles were never to be removed. They were never to be taken out. And so whenever the ark was to be moved, it was never to be put on a cart. It was never to be put on a cart. It was only to be moved by the Levites, and particular Levites. These Levites had to be descendants of Moses, and they would have to come together, and they would have to consecrate themselves and cleanse themselves, and then they would lift these poles and carry this ark on their shoulders, because a human was never, ever supposed to touch the ark, and they were never supposed to set it down on some kind of cart, all right? So again, you're picturing this huge parade, this celebration, harps and tambourines and cymbals and joy and singing at the top of their lungs and all sorts of dancing, and everybody's happy, and Uzzah reaches out and keeps the ark from falling on the ground, and bam! He is struck down dead suddenly. There is weeping and there is screaming. And verse 8 says this, and David was angry because the Lord had broken out against Uzzah. And that place to this day is called Perez Uzzah. So David shakes his fist at God and says, what are you doing? We're doing a good thing here. We're just trying to bring you back to the city. We're just doing everything right. And so what's going on here? Anybody have that question? This is why preachers typically skip this chapter. And I should have too, right? This is what I think. I'm going to do my best here. Point out 2 different ways that God tells us what to do and how to do it. And there's 2 voices through which God pronounces His will. And it's the title of the sermon, right? It's called Precepts and Principles. Precepts and principles. And precepts, they're found especially in the Old Testament. These are direct commands, sometimes to a very specific person or to a specific time period or a group of people. For instance, the 10 Commandments. God gave Israel the 10 Commandments. Remember these? Right? And so they were literally very specific, and they were part of these 613 commands of the Old Covenant, and the Jews were to keep every one of them by the letter. But behind these precepts were some principles, right? That only the Jews were supposed to keep, but you and I can keep the principle, but not necessarily the precept. You with me? For example, this is the easy way to say it. A precept might be, think prescription. The doctor gives you a prescription, and you're supposed to take this pill twice a day, one in the morning, one at night, with or without a meal, or with or without a large glass of water. And it's a prescription. It's a precept, okay? And so a precept might be something like speed limit 35. Just do it. Obey it. A principle might be one of the signs that you see that says, drive safely. Well, that's subjective, isn't it? Because your safety and my safety might be a different kind of safety. Okay? And so here's what's going on. You've got these precepts and you've got these principles. Jesus gave a precept that was very specific to the rich young ruler. You remember he says, go sell everything and give it all away to the poor. Right? Was that necessarily a direct command for you and me? No, but there's a principle there, isn't there? And the principle in that precept is that our stuff shouldn't be more important than God is. Does that make sense? And so too often we live like not having a long list of precepts means God hasn't told us what to do. Because we're like, no, we live under grace, and so we don't have these precepts. We don't have all these rules and all these regulations and all these things that we have to keep. But here's the deal. God still works in the principles. Okay? So a precept might be God says, hey, I want you to go, and I want you to go to Mountainview Christian Church, and I want you to be their lead pastor. Honestly, God never said that to me. I mean, I feel like He called me, and I feel like, there was a process in that was really clear and really obvious that I should do this, but I never had God show up and say, this is what I want you to do. But I'll tell you what, there's a principle, and the principle is God wants me to work for who? For Him. Right? All of us are called to work for Him. We may not feel like we've been directly instructed to take the job that we've got and work in the place we're supposed to work. But one thing that's clear, He may not have prescribed our job for us, but He certainly said, here's a principle. I want you to work for me, whatever job you're in. God didn't come to me and say, here's the deal. You're now a Christian. You're 13 years old. And I want you to grow up, and I want you to mature, and I want you to date, and I want you to marry Sarah Tucker. Never happened. But God certainly has given a clear set of principles about what marriage is and how marriage should be and what I should be doing and how I should treat her and how she should treat me and how we work together in that. Does that make sense? Principles and precepts. And so understanding the difference between principles and understanding the difference between principles and precepts is so important, especially if you're going to take anything home today from this text. And so what I'm going to attempt to do is give us the principles through this incredible odd act, right? Because Uzzah here, you'd agree, looks like he's actually doing God a favor, doesn't he? I mean, think about it. We think when Uzzah put out his hand, he did this, right? He saved the ark of God from hitting the ground. God should have opened up heaven and said, thank you, Uzzah, right? Thank you for making sure that didn't fall off the cart, but instead God kills him. And all of a sudden we think, what is going on here? His heart was good, wasn't it? He had the best of intentions, didn't he? He was trying to do what God wanted him to do. So why would God do this? Here's a principle. We believe the punishment is always more severe than the crime, don't we? Especially when it comes to God. When it comes to God, we look at God and go, but God, they had a good heart. They were trying to do everything right. Why in the world would you create that punishment? Doesn't that kind of seem extreme? All he did was touch it. And so when the punishment is more severe than the crime, there's this little tuning fork that goes off inside of us, and it screams, injustice, injustice. And so our hearts accuse God of being unjust. And this angers us. So we end up being like David, shaking our fist, saying, God, why are you doing this? And so here's the Bible's premise. Here's the principle, and I want to just be straight out with you, and I don't even want to apologize for it, but here's the truth. The punishment is not more severe than the crime. Why? Because there's a couple things going on here. Number one is this. God gave specific instructions about how to carry the ark. Very specific instructions about how the ark was to be carried to avoid this kind of situation. Remember, the poles are covered in gold and they're put through the 4 rings and they were never supposed to live. But instead, what are the Israelites doing? They are carrying the ark of God just like the Philistines did. Exactly like the Philistines did. And this should tell you how God feels about the attitude that sometimes we have. Well, I want to worship God my own way. I want to do it my way. I have a different way to worship than you have a way to worship. And I just kind of want to do it my way, and I'm going to honor God my way. And you can't tell me what to do. Why would you tell me what to do? You can't tell me what to do. Who do you think you are to tell me what to do? And I would say that the message here is pretty clear that God does decide how he wants to be honored and worshiped. He decides. And Uzzah and David, they're not accepting that. They're not approaching God like God has instructed them in how to worship him. And so here's another reality. Uzzah, he is completely unaware of his sinfulness. He's completely unaware of his sinfulness. And this needs to be said. So where's the ark been for the last 9 years? In Uzzah's living room. If you read 1 Samuel chapter 6, Abinadab is Uzzah's dad, and it's been sitting in the living room. And this can happen to us, by the way. Okay? We can just go through life so accustomed to doing the God thing and the church thing that all of a sudden, God's always been there, so why in the world would I worship him? Why would I acknowledge him? Why would I pay attention to the principles or the precepts? Why would I even do that? And so this is what's going on. Uzzah sees the ark, and it's about to touch the ground, and he wants to protect the ark from touching the earth. Why? Because he thinks that keeping the ark from touching the ground, because the ground is dirty. True? But Uzzah, he assumes that his hands are less dirty than the dirt, than the ground. But the earth has never committed the blasphemy of rejecting God's authority. And the earth had always obeyed God's commands. And it wasn't the ground or the dirt that would pollute the ark. It was the touch of man that would pollute the ark. And Uzzah, he doesn't understand this. So he touches the ark, and David doesn't understand this either. So he's mad at God for striking Uzzah dead. And the reason we do not understand the judgment of God is because most often we don't understand the wickedness of our own sinfulness. And so here's Uzzah thinking, I'm more pure than the ground is, because he's not able to see his own sinfulness and acknowledge that he has unclean hands. Do you see this? So look what happens, 2 Samuel chapter 6, verse 9. And David, he was afraid of the Lord that day. Wouldn't you be? Yes. And this is what he said, how can the ark of the Lord come to me? How can the presence of God ever come to me? Have you ever been like that? Have you ever been in this situation with God where God's trying to deal with some things in us, and you kind of step back and you say, whoa, how in the world could I ever have the presence of God with me? How could I ever be used by God? Man, my past and my burdens and my messes and my brokenness, they disqualify me from being in the presence of God. And this is what David's saying. He's saying, whoa, what have I done? How can the ark of the Lord, how can God's presence ever come to me? And so David, he was not willing to take the ark of the Lord into the city of David, but David took it aside to the house of Obed-Edom, the Gittite. So basically what he's saying is, whoa, this is powerful, you take it. Okay? It's like, hey, I don't know what to do with this nuclear bomb, why don't you hold on to it for a couple of days? All right? Seriously, this is kind of what David's doing. He's like, let's ditch this thing as quick as we can and let's get out of town. Okay? And the ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed-Edom, the Gittite, for 3 months. But look what happens. And the Lord blessed Obed-Edom and his entire household. And so literally, David walked away from the Ark of the Covenant of God. He essentially walked away from the presence of God, and it's in the house of someone who is not even a Jew, right? And David, and in this moment, I think that God and David, they kind of broke up temporarily. They kind of had this falling out, right? They kind of had this little, they're taking a break type of thing. And so this is what I want us to see, though. There is a gospel in the ark. There's a gospel message in the ark, and it's beautiful. And it's like God is sending this incredible, beautiful message to David, saying, listen, my intention is a blessing, and David's faith all of a sudden is rekindled, and some incredible things. If you read 1 Chronicles 15, he goes and he learns exactly what he's supposed to be doing now and how to move the ark. And so look at this, 2 Samuel chapter 6, verse 12. And it was told King David, the Lord has blessed the household of Obed-Edom and all that belongs to him because of the ark of God. And so David went and he brought up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with rejoicing. So again, 1 Chronicles 15 tells us that he did it. He was very intentional. He went back. Somebody corrected his thinking and said, no, you don't put that on an ox cart. You need Levites, and the Levites need to be cleansed and consecrated so that they can actually carry this thing for you. And so watch this, verse 13. And when those who bore the ark of the Lord had gone 6 steps, he sacrificed an ox and a fattened animal. Why did he do that? Well, what do we see here? The ark is being carried by people, and David is having the ark carried the correct way now, not the Philistine way. He offered the sacrifices the way God instructed them to offer the sacrifices, because God has provided a way for his presence to be among his people. And the focus here is on mercy and grace. And here's the reality, just like they did with the ark, there was a great sacrifice, and his name was Jesus, who made it possible for God once again to have a relationship with his people. And so there is a gospel message in this ark. Look what continues to happen. And David was wearing a linen ephod. Basically, he's in his skivvies. And so David and all the house of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord with shouting and with the sound of the horn. You see, Jesus would also come and he would die, wouldn't he? And he would take on the full penalty of sin. And what I love about 2 Samuel chapter 6 is Uzzah and Jesus are kind of a lot alike. Uzzah kind of takes the penalty for the sin of the uncleanliness, right? And years later, Jesus would take on the penalty and the condemnation, and he would actually die a vicious death, because of the uncleanliness of the people in which he was dying for. I love this. All of our condemnation and all of God's wrath was being absorbed into Jesus, so not a drop of it was left for me and you. And I love that. And so look at this. One of 2 things will happen to us because of our sin. Either we'll die for it eternally, or we will acknowledge that Jesus died for it and we will live eternally. Verse 16. As the ark of the Lord came into the city of David, Michal, the daughter of Saul, looked out the window. Now, he's married to Michal because Saul said, ooh, take my wife. Or take my daughter. That was weird. Take my daughter, okay? She's yours. Because he wanted to continue, his lineage through the throne. And so he's married, right? So Michal, the daughter of Saul, looked out of the window and saw King David leaping and dancing in his underwear before the Lord. And she despised him in her heart. Man, this is incredible. And they brought in the ark of the Lord, and they set it in its place inside the tent that David had pitched for it. And David offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before the Lord. And when David had finished offering the burnt offerings and the peace offerings, what do? When we've been forgiven much, what happens? We begin to extend that same grace and mercy to others. And this is what David does, right? David, he blesses the people in the name of the Lord of hosts and distributed among all the people, the whole multitude of Israel, both men and women, a cake of bread, a portion of meat, and a cake of raisins for each and every one. And then all the people departed, each to his house. Isn't that incredible? What's going on here? Here's what I understand. I'm going to skip Hebrews, okay? But God works with people who understand his grace. Somebody great said, you will forgive much when you've been forgiven much. I think his name was Jesus. Because it's true. People who understand the grace of God, God works in them. When we acknowledge that we've been forgiven and we've been cleansed and we've been made righteous, right? All these fancy churchy words, all of a sudden, God can begin doing some things, and he works in the people who understand grace. Look at verse 20 of 2 Samuel. And David returned to bless his own household. But Michal, the daughter of Saul, came out to meet David and say, have you ever had one of these conversations before? How the king of Israel honored himself today, uncovering himself today before the eyes of his servants, female servants, as one of the vulgar fellows shamelessly uncovers himself, right? So she's mad. She's like, you did not behave like a king today. What do you think you're doing? Right? Why Samuel didn't say that, I don't know. But it says this, David said to Michal, it was before the Lord who chose me above your father and above all his house, to appoint me as prince over Israel, the people of the Lord, and I will celebrate before the Lord. I will make myself yet more contemptible than this, and I will be abased in your eyes. But by the female servants of whom you have spoken, by them I shall be held in honor. And Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no child to the day of her death. Which is another weird one. We're not going to go to that one today, okay? But here's the principles. What David's saying here is only one person can be the biggest in your life. Either God or you. Only one can be the biggest in my life, either God or me. And so we have to answer this question right now because it's a principle, right? Who's the biggest in my life? Is God the biggest in my life, or am I the biggest in my life? Ask yourself that question. Who's biggest in my life? Is God biggest in my life, or am I biggest in my life? Because this is the deal. David says, listen, God chose me when I was nothing, and now that I am something, I'm going to show everybody that I only became something out of nothing because of what God did. And so it's not about myself, but it's all about God. And so he tells her, he says, your father's problem is that he wanted people to think a lot about him. He took God out of the equation. He wanted to be worshiped. He wanted to be praised. He wanted the most power. He wanted all the glory for himself. And he's like, I'm not your dad. I'm not your dad. I came from nothing. I was a shepherd boy. Now I'm king of the entire nation. And that didn't happen because I'm so powerful or I'm so great or I'm so mighty. It happened because God is my God, and God needs to be biggest in my life. And I want everybody in Israel to see that God is bigger than any of us. That's what he's saying here. And ironically, Michal, right, he says, I don't need glory for myself. That's what you're looking for. That's not what I need. And he says, this is the biggest difference between me and your dad. Saul wanted to be a big deal in everyone's eyes. And I want God to be a big deal in everyone's eyes. Do you want to be a big deal in everyone's eyes, or do you want God to be a big deal in everyone's eyes? And I'm telling you that fundamentally, this will change your life. Things will happen because David was willing. Another principle here. Our worship suggests to others what God's worth is to us. Okay? That's what we see with David here. Our worship should physically demonstrate our admiration for God and who God is, and for God's greatness, and for our gratitude for his grace. Right? Sometimes, and I'm not just talking music, but music's the easiest one to get to, right? We come in and we're like, oh, that song. Listen, I'm a pastor here, and I'm serious. I've told Josh this, all right? I'm like, Josh, I'm not going to be that guy who says I don't like that song, but I don't like that song. Okay? Now, you can do it, but, whatever. I just have an opinion, right? But serious, that shouldn't change my worship. It shouldn't change my posture and my admiration and how great God is. I should be able to celebrate him regardless. I mean, I don't want to be Michal. I don't want to be off to the side going, tambourines and dancing and wearing your underwear, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. I don't want to be that person. I want to be a person who can find the beauty of God in everything when I'm worshiping him. And so David in the Psalms, he says constantly that when he worships, he is aware constantly that that the surrounding nations might hear his voice. And so our worship suggests to others what God's worth is to us. Have you ever thought that maybe one of the reasons our community doesn't take God more seriously is because of how we worship? Because we talk about this great God, but then we worship a lot of other things, don't we? A lot of other things really become bigger and more important in our life. And people are like, what? I thought God was the greatest. If God was the greatest, then why is that happening? Like literally, I think about this, right? Let's say some clearinghouse right now, because one of you sent those things back in the mail that you get trying to get the $1 million. Anybody do that? Don't answer. Never mind. But let's say some clearinghouse comes in here, right? And they've got $1 million check for one of you right now. Okay? TV cameras, horns, and confetti, and that would really irritate Earl. That would be funny. But our building manager. But anyway, and so like confetti everywhere, glitter everywhere, powdered sugar donuts like everywhere. You know what I mean? Those are all the things that really bother Earl. Don't tell him I said that. He's not in this service. And so literally they come in here and they're like, "You've won $1 million. What would we do right now?" We would party, wouldn't we? We'd be like, "No way." And the person getting the $1 million would be like all over themselves, like, right? They'd be going crazy right now. But isn't the grace of God so much better than $1 million? And isn't the redemption that we've had and the relationship that we have with God so much better than $1 million? I know some of you are thinking, "Yeah, but I really need that $1 million." No. And this is what bothers me, right? This is what's hard. This is what I think the world looks at Christians and say, yeah, you say you love God, but you're more excited about the $1 million than you are about the things that you talk about. Because we come in here and we're like, just doing church. We're kind of like Uzzah. He's had the presence of God around him for a long time, and so no big deal, I can touch it. No, our worship communicates something to the world around us. Finally, last principle, and then we got to finish up. Our worship puts our hunger and thirst for God on display for the entire world to see. Okay? Our worship and how we worship, it puts our hunger and thirst for God on display for the entire world to see. Full circle, David wanted the ark. Why did he want the ark? Because he wanted the presence of God. And so he had this hunger and this thirst, this deep desire to do whatever it takes. Now, did he kind of cut corners? Yes. Which we do too, right? We're like, "God, we really want you, but God says, here's what I want you to do." We're like, "I don't think so. I think I'm going to try it this way." Right? We do that all the time. And so this is what David does. He cuts a few corners, but then he gets right, and he's like putting his hunger and thirst for God on display for the entire world to see. Worship is our response to the gospel. Worship is not just what we do and hear when we sing. Worship is about how we live our lives. Worship is about how we spend our money. Worship is what we do with our time. Worship is about the values that we teach our children. Worship is not just about what we do when we sing, but it certainly includes what we do and hear when we sing. Because when we come together and we gather together as a community, and we sing God's praises and we listen to God's teaching, and we put on display the greatness of God and the glory of God in our lives, something incredible happens, right? Something beautiful. And I know some of you are getting really nervous right now because you're thinking the next thing he's going to say is, "Come next week in your skivvies and we'll dance before the Lord." No, some of you would be arrested for that. But do you get the point here? Who is the greatest and the biggest in your life? And does the way you worship in here and out of here prove it? These are principles. And they're there. What do we do with them? We're going to prepare for communion time. Every week at Mountainview we take communion. But I want to read this verse, Jeremiah chapter 3. This verse has grown on me for some reason. And I love verse 15, but later on it says something. Look at this. It says, "I will give you shepherds after my own heart." And I love this. This is God talking to the prophet Jeremiah. He says, "Listen, I'm going to give you shepherds after my own heart." And this is my prayer for me. And pray for it for me. Didn't say this first service, but this. I've been called to be the shepherd of you all at Mountain View. We have lots of pastors and elders. We're all shepherds, but I've been called to be a shepherd. And I want you to pray for me and ask God, help Tom be a shepherd after your heart, God. Because that's the prayer here, right? I love this. "Who will feed you with knowledge and understanding." I've attempted to do that today. Hopefully I haven't messed you up. "And when you have multiplied and have been fruitful in the land in those days, declares the Lord, they shall no more say," I love this, "the ark of the covenant of the Lord. It shall not come to mind or be remembered or missed. It shall not be made again." Why? Because the ark was for a particular time period at a particular place with a particular group of people. And what Jesus did on the cross is he took all the brokenness and all the sinfulness and all the wickedness, and he literally put it upon his own shoulders. And he died the most vicious death on the cross because of the sin and the wickedness and the brokenness of all the world. Right? And when we accept that, we're told we're given this incredible thing called the Holy Spirit, who's like God's presence with us all the time. We don't have to enter some room. We don't have to have a priest enter the room for us, because God gives us his presence so that we can live the principles. We can live this life God's way and not my way. So when you eat this bread and you drink this juice, and I don't know what you need to talk to God about. I don't know what we've said here today that struck your heart, but man, would you take this moment and take this opportunity, just you and God, and have a conversation? Let's pray. God, we prayed at the beginning that you would open our hearts, that you'd open our minds, and that you would fill us up. And so right now, God, we're going to pause, and we're going to eat this little piece of bread, and we're going to drink this little cup of juice, and we're going to remember what Jesus did for us. He really was the most holy of holy, and he took on all the filth and all the dirt and all the brokenness and all the wickedness and the sinfulness of the entire world upon his shoulders, and he dealt with it once and for all on the cross. God, that alone, that act alone, means you are worthy of my praise and my worship. You are worthy of my life to be surrendered to you. And so, God, right now, would you help us eliminate our distractions and to let you speak to us? God, take these few moments where we commune with you and we remember your Son, and talk to us. Help us hear you and what you're wanting in our life. God, we don't want to cut corners. We want to do this life your way. So give us strength, give us courage, and help us hear you in Jesus' name.